Okay, there's Catherine, Billy, Nancy, Debbie, Liz, Daphne, Derry, Bonnie, Stephen, and Liz. Elliot, hi. Janet, hello. Maggie, hello. Jim and Janet. Doug, Betty Lou, Barbara, John, Carolyn, Janet Jones, and Eileen. How does Eileen pronounce her last name? You can unmute. Anybody unmute?
Lamps? I don't know.
Lamps. Okay. Thank you. All right. So good morning and welcome to Exile and Return. It's wonderful to see so many of you familiar faces today, and we have a new face that I haven't seen. She hasn't opened up her video yet. So you all know me. My name is Bill, and it is so great to see all of you here today. Our class is about an ongoing conflict between the Bible and archaeology, or between religion and between history. If you are evangelical or fundamental, you're not going to have a problem with this class because you're going to believe everything the Bible says, and you're not going to have to worry about archaeology and history. So if the Bible says it, it is so, and that's the way it is. Our class is only 4 sessions, and what we're going to be doing is looking at 2 great monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity through the lens of the Bible, or religion, versus history and archaeology. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Because of new technology, there are so many discoveries happening at a very rapid pace, none more so than the lost or ancient city of Luxor, just a couple of miles from the modern Luxor. So this class is not necessarily to provide answers, but it is to raise awareness as well as questions. And we'll have time for questions, and just indicate that in the chat box, or towards the end, we'll have lots of question time. So let's start off with in the beginning. That seems to be a good place to start. And the Garden of Eden. Most of you, if you've had any of my classes in the past, know that from a literary standpoint, there are 2 creation stories in the Bible. The first one is in chapter 1 to chapter 2, verse 4a, and that has no human interaction at all. And many believe that that was written by the priestly writers when the tribe of Israel was in captivity in Babylon between 600 and 500 BC. The second story, the second creation story, is in chapter 2, verses 4b and on. That is a story about Adam and Eve, and whenever people get involved with God, whenever people and God interact, there's always bound to be trouble. And of course, in Adam and Eve, there is lots of trouble. So we have 2 creation stories framing the Jewish culture right from the outset. We move rapidly to Noah and the Ark, which is a powerful biblical story. There is evidence for a flood around that time, or back when, way back when. On the flip side, many feel that this story is a retelling of the Babylonian flood story called the Gilgamesh epic. The story of Noah and the Ark being written yet again, possibly in the Babylonian captivity between 600 and 500 BCE. Now, again, you're probably all aware that most cultures do have a flood story. None more so than our friends to the north, the Hopi, Navajo, and all that. Again, the era of the patriarchs, so we're skipping now a couple of years from Noah to the patriarchs. Abraham is claimed primarily by Judaism, but it is as well by Christianity and Islam. Now, where did Abraham live? Abraham lived right about the top of the Persian Gulf, where the Persian Gulf is. And that was called the land of Ur, U-R. And 2 hours up the road was an older city that was about 5,000 years old called Uruk, U-R-U-K. You'll see more of that in a minute. We know a lot about pastoral nomads. We know historically about the Amorite migration up and over and down into the land of Canaan. It's possible to see an Abraham-like figure in all of these nomadic people that, shepherded herds of sheep, things like that, and goats. But as of yet, there is no historical archaeological evidence for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and everything prior to them. However, the stories are rich in meaning and profound in understanding Judaism. There is an amazing link from creation to the flood, to civilization, to the patriarchs, to the foundation of Israel, and then to the 400 years or 430 years until they got to Egypt, and then finally the Exodus, which we'll hear more about in a minute. But we have a little video for you on Jericho. Miss Sheila, launch away.
Yes. Hang on just a sec. Again, I'm kind of new at this, so just a sec.
"6,000 years before the present, the colossal city of
The volume.
by far the largest in the
Up all the
world,
way.
dominated the southern Mesopotamian plains of modern-day Iraq. With a population of at least 50,000 people, Uruk wouldn't be surpassed in size or in numbers for an astonishing 3,000 years to come, until well into the Classical Age. The legendary homeland of Gilgamesh, a colossal mud brick wall said to have been erected by the great hero king himself, once enclosed the city's impressive 6-kilometer radius. Yet, impressive as it was, Uruk didn't exist in a vacuum. The city was simply the latest, albeit most successful, in a long line of similar experiments in living, dating all the way back to the Stone Age. More than 5,000 years before the founding of Uruk, other, smaller, though no less impressive settlements had begun to coalesce and form in this region of the world. The very first known examples of static, communal living in history. In other words, though the exact definition varies, the first cities on Earth.
Can you all hear this?
Most well known of these settlements, perhaps due to its often cited links to the biblical walls of Jericho of the Old Testament, remains arguably the most impressive of all. Jericho is a place of firsts. Here, 5,000 years before Uruk, can be found the first known settlement in history to be surrounded by walls. Some of the earliest evidence of cooperation between a group larger than a single clan or kinship. The first significant evidence of large-scale communal labour. And, when it was first discovered, the first tower, complete with walled steps, in history. What makes this especially striking is that besides a scattering of mysterious pictographic symbols, writing wouldn't develop for thousands of years to come. Even pottery didn't exist yet, though, nevertheless, these people still came together here all those millennia ago and achieved something astonishing. We don't know where they came from. We don't know their ethnicity. We don't know who their gods were. But we do know this may be one of the first places on Earth where animals were domesticated and agriculture experimented with on a wide scale. All of this was achieved an astonishing 11,000 years before the present, just a few centuries after the end of the last ice age, a time when woolly mammoths still walked the earth. What makes Jericho all the more fascinating is that, unlike other sites such as Uruk, which always rested upon fragile ecological roots and altering river courses, the spring here has never dried up, meaning people still live here today. This is the story of Jericho, one of the oldest cities on Earth.
There we are. Okay, so one of the earliest civilized cities known to us is not Ur, where Abraham was from at the top of the Persian Gulf, not Uruk, U-R-U-K, 2 hours up the road. But if you go all the way up the Euphrates, across the desert a bit, and down into what we call the Levant, have you all heard that phrase before, L-E-V-A-N-T? Or the Promised Land, or the land of the Canaanites. One of the things is that I'll share with you is that there are many scholars who believe that the ancient Canaanites were also the ancient ancestors of the Israelites. Now, that's different from what the Bible talks about. In the Bible, the Canaanites are the enemies of the Israelites, but historically, there are some who believe that they were the forerunners to the Israelites. Jericho, which archaeological evidence shows is at least 11,000 years old, beginning around 9,000 BC. I mention that because one of the first areas to show, they are one of the first areas to show the transition between hunting and being an agrarian or farming society. But I also mention it because thousands of years later, Jericho gets recognition in the Bible when the Israelites leave the wilderness and Joshua goes to Jericho with his soldiers. They walk around the city, right? And they blow their trumpets and the walls come a-tumbling down. Maybe. The problem with that is that digging through the many, many layers of ancient Jericho, as many as 20 different cultures or settlements have been found. And what did the archaeology find? They found a flourishing city by the Middle Bronze Age, but that it had been destroyed and kind of rebuilt long before it flourished again. These 6-foot walls that Joshua and his soldiers were marching around had already come down hundreds and hundreds of years earlier from a large earthquake that had hit the area. And when they were unpacked and discovered, they were lying all over the place. And what was in their place? But a rampart of packed mud walls. Now, packed mud walls are very different than 6-foot wide walls all the way around. One theory that circulated in the history archaeological world is that there was something called the Ugaritic legend of Kirit. I know all of you will remember that. The Ugaritic legend of Kirit in 14th century BCE. And what was that legend? According to this story, King Kirit, besieged a city called Udum, Udum, for 6 days, then, and I quote, attacked with his forces amid a huge blast of noise, and the walls came down and the city surrendered. So, it's like for every thing, and again, remember, I'm not challenging the Bible. I'm just saying that there are sometimes two different stories on these things. So with that, we will move on to, let's see, no, we don't move on quite yet. We continue on. What is the most central story and theme in all of Judaism? Anybody? You got to unmute yourselves if you want to talk. Just unmute yourself.
The Exodus.
You got it. The Exodus. It is a neatly written, tidy delineation of escape to freedom under one God. The law is given in the wilderness. The passage is through the Red Sea. Oops. The real translation is Yom Suf, Y-A-M-S-U-P-H, Yom Suf, and it means the Reed Sea, R-E-E-D, or better told, the Sea of Reeds, R-E-E-D-S. And indeed, there was a Sea of Reeds at that time. And so the tradition for the Jews begins for us. Now, if I can find my place. Most of us probably are familiar with the Exodus through Cecil B. DeMille's epic movie, The Ten Commandments. Who could possibly not be thrilled watching Charlton Heston extend his arms and say, the Lord will save you, and the sea is parted, and they went out from Egypt. And in Egypt, when they were there, Moses approaches the Pharaoh in Exodus 11:4. He talks about midnight. The Lord says, I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. But Pharaoh did not let the people of Israel go. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said, slaughter the Passover lamb. Take hyssop, dip it in the blood from the lamb, and put it on the doorpost and lintel of each house. Now, from here on, guys, we're going to kind of dive in. So hang on. If there are things you don't understand, please let me know. Then the Israelites are given detailed instructions for the Passover meal on their night of escape. Exodus 12, verse 37, the Israelites journeyed about 600,000 men on foot, beside women, children, and livestock. So most people believe that probably about 1 million people exited Egypt. All right, so let's back up. The time that Israel had lived in Egypt was 430 years. It is said when Moses went out of the land of Egypt, he took the bones of Joseph with him. So somehow he found a grave, found the bones, took the bones with him into the wilderness. Let's talk about the Passover. The specific meal biblically was one night, and we call that the Pesach meal or the sacrifice meal. The rest of the days of Passover are tied into something called the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That went on for 6 days. And back in ancient times, the agricultural Feast of Unleavened Bread was just that, an agricultural festival timed to the spring barley harvest. And eventually the two, the Pesach and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, were merged together and written into the Exodus saga. With that in mind, The Exodus saga has been guidance to Judaism for millennia, 3,000 years as a matter of fact. And so at this point, we'll get a sense of what happened in the wilderness. Yes, Sheila, go for it.
The 10 Commandments one?
Yes, we're going into the wilderness. We are crossing out of the desert of Egypt.
Okay,
And we are now languishing in the wilderness.
Woe unto thee, O Israel! You have sinned a great sin in the sight of God. You are not worthy to receive these 10 commandments.
We're gathered against you, Moses. You take too much upon yourself. We will not live by your commandments. We're free.
There is no freedom without the law.
Whose law, Moses? Yours? Did you carve those tablets to become a prince over us?
Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come to me.
You have cursed us.
And the people made me do.
Joshua! Joshua!
Classic
I
film.
showed you no land flowing with milk and honey. I show you a God of gold. Come with me. Follow me.
Blasphemers, idolaters, for this you shall drink bitter waters. God has set before you this day his laws of life and good and death and evil. Those who will not live by the law shall die by the law.
Oh,
Okay, so the ones that stood by Abraham looked to be about 20 people, but theoretically there were supposed to be about 1 million people. And of course, anyway. So what we have now up to this point is a thread that the writers of the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible have created from creation and down through Noah, through the Tower of Babel, to the patriarchs, on down very neatly into Egypt. The 430 years of captivity is just simply that. And then you have this story of the Exodus, which, as Catherine pointed out, is in fact the main theme of the Jewish faith apart from the law. Here's the problem. There is no historical proof. Again, remember, we're going back and forth between Bible and history archaeology. There is no historical archaeological evidence for a Moses. There is no historical archaeological evidence for the Exodus. Now, having said that, there has been a fight in every decade to prove that the Exodus was real. And some people have tried, and there have been some efforts to show that, in fact, it was. The problem is there has yet to be no evidence. Now, if you're searching through the wilderness and you're an archaeologist, you got a lot of ground to cover. So what we do know is that there was something eventually in 1204 BCE called the Merneptah Stela. Can you all see that? This is one line of the stela, and the stela is a 10-foot slab of stone, which at the very bottom mentions that the king Merneptah went into the upper lands above the upper Nile and, in fact, laid Israel to waste and their seed to waste. It doesn't say Israel in this text. It says I period, S period, R period, and then a space, and then I. But these figures depict a group of foreign people called by that name, and it says they laid their seed to waste. They haven't said, and nobody has claimed, whether it's the reproductive seed or the destruction of grain. There's also an indication that there was an an agricultural movement up into the promised land around that time, that there was a fair amount of migration going back and forth out of Egypt. But we also know from later years that there were colonies of Israelites that remained in Egypt. Okay, so we've brought them out of Egypt. What we know about Egypt at that time is that there was a drought in the land due to a scarcity of food around the time of the Exodus. We also know historically that there was a steady migration of agricultural people up into the hill country of Canaan. So there is further evidence of a separate people, as they were distinct communities. And if you've been in previous classes, you'll know that Canaanite communities had lots of bones, and they ate anything they wanted to, and bones were everywhere. However, there was a different society nearby. When they dug up the pits and the garbage pits of the folks, there were no pork bones. So you all remember that there was an injunction against eating pork. Well, in fact, one of the more profound pieces of evidence of Israel in the Holy Land is that there were no pork bones in any of their sites, but there were loads of pork bones in the Canaanite sites. Time is short, but when Joshua left the wilderness, there was a thing called the Holy War theology. Joshua, if you remember, was commanded to wipe out all the foreigners. So what you have are all these people in the wilderness. They've received one of the most important things they'll ever receive, and that is the law. The doing of the law makes one righteous. And so these people went up into the promised land. But first, you recall that Joshua was supposed to have gone out and slaughtered all the foreigners so that they didn't end up polluting the religion of Israel. All right, why in the world would God command them to do that? Anybody know? Why did God command Joshua to go into Jericho and all these lands and slaughter the foreigners? Well, because about 700 years later, those foreigners, by the way, had lots of gods, little stone gods everywhere. And about 700 years later, that's going to come into play big time, because that in the end is going to be what is blamed for as the reason that Israel and Judah were taken captive, and all of Israel was basically laid to waste by the Babylonian king. They needed a reason for God's people to have been completely taken out. And the reason were the little stone gods that the Canaanites had, and they found many examples of them in the Israelite homes. So much to cover and so little time. So for all the Bible scripture versus history archaeology, much of which is aligned, by the way, There is much that remains in debate. And of course, the Exodus is probably the hottest topic that remains in debate. One of the other topics that remained in debate was David, King David, the House of David, anything like that. And in fact, by 1990, people were saying David, King David, is a folk hero. There's no evidence for him. There's no anything for him. And in fact, he is a figment of people's imagination and a figment of the writer's imagination. All of that debate came to an end in 1993 when they found abundant evidence for the House of David. There were scroll writings, there were pieces of stone carved that said House of David. And then, of course, as archaeology became more fancy and there was more technology that allowed them to see into layers of the ground, they realized that they had found, in fact, the House of David, and they had found the entire physical kingdom of the House of David, which was on the southern end of Jerusalem. So I think at that point, that takes us to, where does that take us to? It takes us to Dr. Jody Magnus, who is a professor of religious studies at Chapel Hill in North Carolina. She teaches in the area of early Judaism. She has received umpteen different awards for excellence in her books and research. She is also one of the top 5 leading archaeologists in the world today. And I had the pleasure of meeting with her and talking with her for quite a while at conferences back on the East Coast until I realized what her name was. I was just starstruck at that point. But Sheila, if you can go ahead and play Jody, she will be giving you a lot better understanding of some of these things.
Land. So I'm going to start this first lecture by...
Hang on, I got to make it big, just a sec.
It's video number 1, by the way.
I know.
Introducing you to some very key concepts, some chronology, some terms of dating. And then we will, towards the end of the lecture, talk about the earliest inhabitants of the Holy Land, the Canaanites. So first of all, to start with some key definitions, I'd like to start with the term the Holy Land. This term Holy Land is actually a very Christian term and a Christian concept. And it is true, we will spend a lot of time over the course of these lectures talking about Christianity and Jesus in the Holy Land. But what are some of the other terms for this piece of territory? It's actually a piece of territory that, due to political reasons, is quite controversial. For example, sometimes we refer to this piece of territory as Palestine. In fact, over the course of our lectures, I will be using the term Palestine quite a bit. I will use it not in the modern politically loaded sense of the word, but actually in a more ancient sense of the word to refer to the territory of modern Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories. Now, of course, some people don't feel comfortable referring to this territory as Palestine, and so sometimes you will hear a different term used, that is the term Land of Israel, which is actually an ancient biblical term, in Hebrew, Eretz Israel. And of course, sometimes this land is called Canaan, after the earliest inhabitants, who we'll be talking about a little bit later in this lecture. The area of ancient Palestine is part of a much larger geographical region called the Ancient Near East. The Ancient Near East encompasses the area of modern Turkey, Syria, Palestine, down to Egypt, through Jordan, across to Iraq, and into the area of modern Iran. Now, for antiquity, we refer to this as the Ancient Near East or the Near East, but it basically corresponds with the same geographical region that today we call the modern Middle East. And this is actually a very interesting thing. Why do we refer to it as the Near East for ancient periods, but the Middle East for modern periods? And it all has to do with perspective. Because in antiquity, our sources who wrote about this territory were mostly writers or authors living in the area of Greece and Italy. From their perspective, this was the Near East. But in the modern world, our perspective has moved farther away to Western Europe and North America. And so today, in modern times, we refer to this as the Middle East, but it, in terms of the actual geographical extent, is pretty much identical with the ancient Near East. Now, I also want to point out a couple of key geographical regions within the ancient Near East. The area today that is occupied by the country of Turkey is a landmass that is sometimes referred to as Asia Minor, and sometimes Turkey is referred to as the area of Anatolia. Both of these are ancient terms, and we will be using the term Asia Minor over the course of our lectures to refer to the area of modern Turkey. Another geographical term that's very common is Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is a Greek word that literally means the land between the rivers, referring to the land, the territory between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia is not a country, it is a geographical territory, just as we use the term North America to refer to a geographical territory, and within that area of North America today there are different countries. And so in the area of ancient Mesopotamia, there were different countries over the course of time. For example, Babylonia and Assyria, which we will be mentioning in our lectures. And today, of course, the area of Mesopotamia is occupied by the modern country of Iraq. The area to the east of that, the area to the east of Mesopotamia in antiquity, was ancient Persia, which today corresponds pretty much with the area of modern Iran. So let's now define some basic sort of chronological terms, some periods that we're going to be mentioning over the course of our lectures. First of all, we're going to be talking at the beginning of the course especially about the First Temple and the First Temple period. The First Temple refers to Solomon's Temple, the temple built by Solomon on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, which was built approximately 960 BC and stood until 586 BC when it was destroyed by the Babylonians. So that period from approximately 960 to 586 BC is what we refer to as the First Temple period. A little while later, a second Jewish temple was built on the site of the Temple Mount where Solomon's temple had previously been. We call that temple the Second Temple. It was consecrated in
Coming up.
I'm finding the other part.
Yep.
would then include Testament period. And that would then include what we call the Bronze Age, which is the Canaanite period, the period when the Canaanites were the inhabitants of the country, and the Iron Age, which is the Israelite period, the period when the Israelites come in and settle down. In terms of absolute dates, the Bronze Age dates approximately 3000 to 1200 BC, and the Iron Age dates approximately 1200 to 586 BC. And that date, 1200, for the beginning of the Iron Age, is really a big watershed for the division between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age all around the Eastern Mediterranean. This period of the biblical period, and in particular the Iron Age, encompasses or includes the First Temple period, which, as we already mentioned, dates approximately 960 to 586 BC. So let's now talk about the arrival of the Canaanites. We're going to start with these very early inhabitants of the Holy Land, which is basically that somewhere around 3000 BC, around 5,000 years ago, these people who the Bible calls the Canaanites entered Palestine and settled down, and hence we refer to the country as Canaan. When the Canaanites first settled in the country, they established small villages around the country. And over the course of the next several hundred years, some of those villages began to grow into towns, and eventually some of those towns grew into cities. So that what we end up with eventually is Canaanite civilization being an urban civilization, an urban culture based around city-states. And the eventual configuration of what we have in Canaan then, are a series of independent city-states around the country, where at the core of each one of these city-states is a fortified city, which controls a certain territory around it. And these city-states were all independent from each other, and sometimes were in conflict with each other, but never were they united under the rule of a single ruler in the way that Egypt, for example, was unified under the rule of a pharaoh. We
Go ahead
have
and cut it
remains
if-
of these Canaanite
I'm sorry?
city-states at various sites
ahead and
throughout the
cut it at
country
this
that have
point.
been excavated, and I'm going to mention only a few.
You want me to stop it?
Yeah, please. I'm looking at the clock and realizing I'm going to have to cut a lot out, but I'm going to sum up here a little bit. The bottom line is the Jewish history and the Jewish traditions are so incredibly rich in what they have to say. Really, truly, without an understanding of Judaism, it is almost, well, it is difficult to fully experience what Jesus had to say and did in his lifetime. So now the people have come out of Egypt. They are going into the promised land. The Holy War theology didn't work out like it was supposed to. All the foreigners weren't killed. They continued to exist. And we went into a time then of the prophets. You had, Samuel. You had the guy who was Samson, who was one of the major players, and people like Deborah and Esther and so forth. You get to a time where Israel is nationalizing, and that happens under King David. And after David, you have Solomon and the first temple. It is supposed to be a spectacular temple, and indeed there has been evidence to show that, in fact, it was spectacular. As time goes on, down through the hundreds of years after Solomon, Solomon's sons were nasty, wicked, evil people who did all kinds of wicked, nasty, evil things. And so that by the time you get into about 200 years after Solomon, the kingdom of Israel is split in half. The northern kingdom is called Israel, in fact, and the southern kingdom of Israel is called Judah. In 722, the Assyrians come over that landmass way north of the Babylonians. They conquer the northern kingdom of Israel, and that is our first beginning of a diaspora, meaning the dispersion of the Jewish people outside of Israel. The definition of dispersion or diaspora is really any people outside of their homeland that have been driven out. So when northern Israel is conquered, that is really the last we hear, because there are people who went from northern Israel into the southern kingdom of Judah. There are those who continued beyond into the land of Egypt. There are those who went east, believe it or not, past Syria and east towards the areas of Uruk and into the area of Persia. The northern kingdom is no more. We really don't hear a lot about that, although the northern kingdom there was a capital up there, and it was Samaria. So pretty soon and over time, you have people called Samaritans. Okay, 150 or 130 or so years later, Babylon is in existence, and they are down there where Ur and Uruk out in the desert there, and then Babylon. Babylon comes and marches over 740 miles down into the promised land and takes all of the brilliant minds away from the kingdom of Judah. They decided they would push on to Egypt, but that was another 440 miles. And the Babylonian armies were stretched thin at that point. So they brain drained Jerusalem, took them all back to Babylon, another 740 miles back. And that was that, except there were a lot of people left in Judah, and they became rebellious. And however they got communication about this, carrier pigeon, who knows? The Babylonian armies come back, and now they're mad. They're really mad. They lay Jerusalem totally to waste. The first temple is destroyed. The people are taken back to Babylon, where a lot of the Tanakh or the Hebrew scriptures are written in a much more orderly fashion. You would think that the people would have been slave labor, which some of them were, but actually, and in fact, their faith grew much stronger. So what we have then, skipping ahead about 70 years to 539 BC, Cyrus, the Persian king, comes in, lays waste to the Babylonians with not much struggle at all, and says to the people, take off, go back to Jerusalem, rebuild. Some did. Some stayed in Babylon. Some went east to Persia. Some went south into Egypt. This is slightly different than what we hear in the Bible. But what we do know is that the Israelites went back to Jerusalem, and most importantly, begins the birth of Judaism. They are no longer Israelites, but they are Jews. Because they were from Judah, they are now named Judahites, and the Jewish faith begins in earnest. A lot of the law begins in earnest. A lot of the traditions begin in earnest. And most importantly, there is almost no archaeological or historic evidence of any gods from the Canaanites being in their homes after 500 BCE. The worship of Yahweh as one monotheistic religion is enormous at that point. They have learned their lesson. They rebuild the walls of the temple. They begin to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, actually. And of course, you all remember when one of the Canaanite kings comes around and says to Nehemiah, come on down from your walls. I need to talk to you. Nehemiah says, nope, I'm doing a great thing. I can't come down and talk to you. And of course, the Canaanite king wanted to meet him out on the plain of Ono, which is a real place. But of course, sermons emanate from that, the plain of Ono. So anyhow, what we have at this point, and I promise you next time, this is going to tighten up a lot now that we've had our first experience here. The Israelites go through this enormous movement, get into the land of promise. They are eventually taken captive. That is explained by the multiple gods they keep in their homes. During the captivity, they straighten up, they strengthen their faith, they go back to Jerusalem and many places. And there you have the end, as it were, of the first diaspora. Next time, we're going to move, well, let's see, we've moved about, 100,000 years, whenever creation started, maybe 1 billion years, into 539 BC when King Cyrus of Persia says, go ahead and go back home. Think about this. The Persian kings at the birth of Jesus, 3 wise men. Persia was a real fan of the Jews. And the Jews were a real fan of Persia all the way up through time. And it seems to start at this dispersion time when Cyrus comes in, deposes the king of Babylon, and Babylon goes the way of all things. We're not going to play anything more. I had another, video to play for you. But we'll continue on with this next time because I know Sheila needs to get to the sanctuary and I need to get ready myself. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, John.
Well, you said a few minutes ago that when the Israelites were dispersing and then returning, it was different than what it says in the Bible. I didn't understand which part was different.
Sure. When the Israelites were supposed to have left Babylon and gone back to Jerusalem, it talks about them going back. It doesn't talk a lot about what happened, though, to the many, many other Israelites who went elsewhere or who stayed, as a matter of fact, in Babylon. So what we really pick up with is Nehemiah and Ezra in Jerusalem after the time that Cyrus tells the people it's okay to go home. See, by then there have been a couple of generations, and some of the newer generation people, all they knew was Babylon. And so a lot of them stayed there.
Okay, thanks.
I'll call you. Anybody else? Okay, good to see all of you. We will have a much newer, richer experience next week based on my learnings of today. Stephen, bye-bye. Liz, good to see you. And everybody, we'll see you on stage in the sanctuary, I hope. There's Peter. Bye.